been active in the womb all along. Now, I do have this, the new embryology, as I call it, it was revolutionary, but it included a lot of speculations that turned out not to be correct. One of them was that the human being was found inside the sperm, just fully formed, but just very, very, very small. It's known as the homunculus. And there was a version of that ultimately about the egg as well, that maybe the human being is just originates in the egg. So there were lots of theories about what was going on that proved to be incorrect, and that was one of them. This other scientist thought he saw a full baby in what's presumably an ovary in the uterus. I mean, that's not possible. So lots of speculation, but it is a scientific change, and as the science changed, the theological understanding of the unborn also changed. The Sicilian priest Emmanuel Congiamilla wrote in his work Sacred Embryology, this is in the 1700s, that fetuses should be baptized if their safe delivery was in doubt. And this became a big subject of discussion in the 1700s and 1800s. If the unborn really are human from conception forward, should they be baptized if at all possible? Discussion mainly among Catholics, who practiced infant baptism. There's even a theory you just insert a syringe and somehow enable water to make contact with the embryo. And I'm not going to go into theories of baptism, and but it just gives you a sense of how this new scientific understanding is shaping some theological questions. So, inspired by this new embryology, American physicians lead the cause for legal protection of the unborn, and that fight needed to be led. American law was shaped by the common law of England. Under the common law, abortion was a crime after quickening, but not clearly so before. Physicians lamented that the law was so far behind medical understanding of the unborn. They were concerned both about the danger of abortion to the woman and abortion as the taking of a human life. Physicians founded the American Medical Association, the AMA, in 1847 and made opposition to abortion one of the AMA's main causes. I had a colleague at a college where I used to teach who I was talking to about this, and he was just he was shocked that that American physicians had ever been pro-life, had ever, as a group, opposed abortion. He just had a very different view of them today. Some of you, if you're a physician, you might say it's mixed now. I don't know, but the AMA, when its founding, this is the point where abortion is one of the main causes. They're trying to encourage state legislators to enact laws protecting the unborn from the practice of abortion. And from 1821 to 1910, every American state did enact a law against abortion. These laws typically prohibited abortion throughout pregnancy and punished it equally no matter when in the pregnancy it occurred. Half of the statutes defined abortion as manslaughter or murder. Most referred to the fetus as a child. Abortion was not made a capital offense, but it was punishable with imprisonment. These laws were normally passed without controversy. Legislators deferred to the authority of the physicians in approving these measures. So, this is all going on in the 1800s. By the year 1900, there was a real pro-life consensus in America. The doctors and the lawmakers had lined up behind the view that the unborn child was fully human from conception forward and should receive legal protection. The clergy, still mainly Protestant, were falling in line as well. There was no pro-choice movement in America, and none of these three elite groups that I've mentioned, the clergy, the physicians, the lawmakers, contained a significant vocal resistance to this pro-life consensus. So that's the situation going into the 1900s. So what happened? How did we go from a nation where every state affirms the right to life of the unborn child to 1973 in the Roe v. Wade decision. And even after that, the rise in abortions to more than 1 million per year by the 1980s. I don't have time for that full story of developments in the 20th century. I think probably some of the pieces of that story are more familiar to you than the story from the 1800s. But I will say, just as a way of looking at this conceptually, I think that the pro-life consensus that was formed in the 1800s was a partial one, and it was fragile for that reason. It relied on the support of these three elite groups, the clergy, the physicians, and the lawmakers. It didn't fully penetrate into popular belief. Enforcement of the laws against abortion proved difficult. Sometimes complicit witnesses to an abortion refused to testify. Jurors hesitated to convict. In many American cities at the turn of the century saw no more than 1 or 2 convictions for abortion per year. And these typically came in cases involving the death of the mother. A Chicago physician lamented in 1904 that, quote, "the law is further advanced than apparently the public demand for its enforcement would require." In New York City, a physician grimly reported in 1912, "Embryonic humanity has no more sanctity nor protection than the rats which infest New York's docks." So, I didn't come tonight to be a downer and talk about how how bad it was. But I think some of this historical evidence has to be received and absorbed and interpreted and assessed and appreciated in terms of what are we trying to do now? If this is what was happening in the past, what are we trying to do now? So what happens, though, is partly the elites begin to back away from their own consensus. The consensus doesn't hold, and the physicians' retreat was especially damaging. And we begin to see this by at least the 1930s. I don't want to say too much because I do want to leave some time for questions. The 1930s, eugenics makes a big impact not only in American society and in European society, but in the medical community. Eugenics, the theory that the human race can be improved through selective reproduction, encourage the fit to have children, discourage the unfit from having children. Eugenicists encourage young people to marry well, look into the family background of prospective mates to ensure a good genetic match. We don't probably put that way to our own children today, but probably some ideas. Don't just look at the person you're dating, look at their family. I mean, what's his dad like? What are his uncles like? What kind of family is he growing up in? Not simply for environmental reasons, but maybe that there's something inherited. They're inherited traits. And so that's part of eugenics. What kind of children? So it extends to the children you might have. Children get their basic qualities by inheritance, the caption reads. If they're to be strong, keen, efficient, and great, there must be good blood back of them. If you want your children to be well born, choose your husband because of fine qualities in his family as well as in himself. Then add the best training. So that, some of this, it's almost might strike us as quaint today when it's the language is indirect in that way, but it could be much more direct and stronger toward discouraging people with negative qualities that were believed to be inherited from having children. These are some eugenicists sort of with their placards in language as though that they themselves are unfit in speaking. So, I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the craving to others? I am a hardship to myself in the state. Should I be allowed to propagate? Some unfit people are poets. Would the prisons and asylums be filled if my kind had no children? And then maybe my favorite, I cannot read this sign. By what right have I children? So all these things are thought to sort of be inherited. And the way to improve society is to ensure that unfit people don't have children. This thinking spills over into questions of population, fertility, sterilization, birth control, and abortion. The unborn child in the womb of a fit mother could be idealized as a symbol of a future improved humanity, but the unborn child in the womb of an unfit mother could be easily stripped of human status and the right to life. This is more, the more severe language. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives. This is part of a banner. They actually did have lights flashing, a little light bulb there. This light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the U.S. that will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. So they didn't give a percentage for the top one, but I think it's more than 4%. There was an account of a guy who went to, I hope this doesn't offend anyone here from Virginia, but a eugenicist took a crew of young assistants to Western Virginia and determined that the whole population was unfit. And that they should, ideally they would all be eugenicized out of existence. Yes.
I thought I should say something since I'm president of Life First. I am a physician, and used to talk about the guys going fishing, and one guy said, Joe said to Harry, what's the two biggest problems in the world? What's the biggest problem in the world? Is it ignorance or apathy? And the other guy said, I don't know and I don't care. So I was talking to Jim Schultz too. When we started, we talked about Kanye West conversion, and when you mentioned conversion of the heart, our organization prides itself on educating people, so having a professor here talking about this, and as a physician, I'm educated. It was a no-brainer when life begins. Yet physicians are the ones that are performing the abortions. They're the abortionists, not a lot of them. And so our goal is to educate people so they can't say, okay, the reason I'm for abortion is because I'm ignorant. So we're going to take that excuse away, so we'll end up with being apathetic or just not wanting to know the truth. And Newt Gingrich and my aunt taught history for 50 years, and they always say, if you want to understand today, you got to understand history, which is your specialty. And so I apologize for this topic, to try to condense it. That's what we had to work with today.
No, it's helpful. It's helpful because then you have to think about, what is really the meaning of the history that you're studying. So it's a helpful exercise for me, definitely.
And I sort of lost it in there somewhere. You had, the medical, the scientific and medical doctors. You had the pastors, the spiritual, and you had the legislators. And then you start getting into Margaret Sanger, and it almost becomes like, an economic versus, if you go by facts and science, as time goes on, it should be a no-brainer. So something else is working there, and I don't know if it's just simply spiritual good versus evil. I mean, where is Sanger and all them? They're not really any of those three professions. So somewhere in there, either they won over the doctors, or won over the pastors, or won over the legislators. Maybe it's more political than, so I'm not asking for an answer to that. It's just, my mind sort of is just confused, and I probably would.
Yeah, no, and it becomes, I think it becomes a much more, the parts of the story that are visible to us become much more complex in the 20th century than the 19th. I see the 19th century society as a society that does have elites who actually exert a large degree of moral influence on the society as a whole. And I think that influence is lost in the 20th century for external reasons, but also for some internal ones. I think the AMA ultimately in the early 70s just backs off and says it's up to each physician. They don't even bother doing things like Tausigdig, creating a list of circumstances under which an abortion would be medically appropriate. They just wash their hands of it. So I think there's some backing off from elite groups that were otherwise expected to exert moral leadership, and then the vacuum simultaneously is entered into by people outside those elites. So it becomes much more complex. Yes, I don't know if we can continue on that, or I can.
Well, my observation is power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's been a group of people that have all throughout history know that to control the masses of people, you control the education, you control their mindset. And through public education and stuff, they have been programmed to accept what's been taught to them. And now that we have internet and YouTube and Facebook, all this stuff, we have opportunities to challenge that mindset, to just, with logic, slow them down, let's give some coffee and donuts, let's talk about this, that's my old saying. And I think we can get a lot done just on a smaller basis, you and me one-on-one talking to small groups, and just get them to thinking. And once they see that baby, they see it move with the ultrasound, it changes the whole picture that we didn't have 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it takes, I guess one element of what I'm saying, or what I failed to say perhaps, is that, I think it takes a long time for something to really penetrate a culture, multiple generations, even things like, how to drive a car, kids can take driver's ed, but, in a culture where the car has been around a long time, they learn tips from their family, and, there's sort of a communal knowledge that has a greater depth that develops. And I think what happens here is that knowledge of the unborn isn't there. There are other things that cause people in American history to have very positive views of children, to pregnancy, to childbirth, everything else, but that basic knowledge about the humanity of the unborn is not there. It's later arriving in the history of our whole civilization. So I think it's going to take a while for it to seep in as deeply as lots of other things that we believe have seeped in, about morals and other things. So I guess I have a sort of underlying theory about historical change and its slowness, really. But see, here's the thing: if you thought that. If we think that everybody in America in the 1800s and 1900s believed that the unborn was fully human from conception forward, then what happened in Roe looks like a coup. It's like a sudden, shocking thing, and it's like everyone has been suddenly spellbound, by 9 Supreme Court justices and Margaret Sanger and a relatively small group of people. But if we think of the back history as something different, then Roe is a different kind of case, and I think how we approach our task is different. There are a lot of hands. I don't usually talk over raised hands. My students are so reluctant to raise their hands, and I usually shut up immediately. So, but go ahead. I forget who was next.
What I wanted to know was, when you were looking at all of this, did they talk about going further to infanticide?
Who is they?
When you were looking at the history, did they go further than abortion? Did they go?
Like in the 19th century?
Yes, in the 18th or 19th century.
No. I don't know of anybody in 19th century America who ever defended infanticide.
Or even late-term abortion. That would be after quickening, of course.
Yeah, so...
So are we now further than we've ever been?
I see what you're saying. So that would be a real unprecedented deterioration if people were promoting infanticide today. Yeah, no, I agree.
It is happening.
Yeah, you mean with the abandonment of aborted fetuses that survived the abortion procedure.
That, and I believe that there was a Virginia governor
That's
that
right.
was a physician too, that
And the New York
said that they
legislature.
wouldn't help the baby after it was born. They could decide.
Right, if the baby was intended to be aborted and survived. Yeah. No, see, I don't recall any discussion of that scenario from the 19th century. I think that is a modern scenario. But there is huge legal concern about infanticide, about the abandonment. Babies, the concealment of a newborn baby is a crime, even if the baby is dead, right? Because it suggests foul play. So yeah, there's lots of concern against infanticide. Does that help? Or yes, in the back, I think.
When you mentioned that the AMA has given physicians the option to, decide what they want to do individually, is that correct? Did I understand that correctly? Or because there's no list for them, so of reasons they could abort. Is there a list? Are there reasons that they should be able to ever abort at any time? Do you know of any list?
Right. You mean right now?
Yeah.
I do not know of any. And in fact, I gave a talk to a group of medical students in San Antonio a couple of years ago, and I was trying to encourage them. It's like abortion is a medical procedure that is different from almost any other that I know of. And maybe, doctor, you can. It's like other procedures. There's a standard of care. If someone has a cold, maybe some doctors vary on how they treat it, but there's a certain range of treatments. It's not. No one is saying you should, spin around 3 times and jump, and that's a cure for the cold. There's a limit on the treatments. But abortion, doctor, there is no standard of care for a woman who comes in and says, I'm feeling depressed about my pregnancy. The doctor could either say, I will refer you to a counselor, or would you like an abortion? I mean, is that overstating the reality, or?
Well, it's an inconvenience. They don't really care what the reason is. It's legal. So if it's legal, it's okay to do it, even though the doctor knows it's killing a human being. That's why I got involved in this, because it was so obvious. I'm thinking, what am I missing here? It's just so obvious. A 2-year-old knows this. They do know that. They know that's a baby. But we adults don't. But that's what's so disappointing with me and my profession.
Yeah.
Is we're the ones doing the procedure.
So there has been a distortion, I think, in that I think there's been a corruption of the medical community, and that's why I've tried to encourage medical students and physicians. I've spoken to physicians before as well. That historically, you're the ones who move the country the most in the pro-life direction. So. I think the movement needs heavy participation from physicians, nurses, other medical personnel. Just looking, that's an intuition looking at it historically, because this idea of the standard of care has collapsed. It seems to me, right? That this procedure is medically treated or perceived in a way that's different from other medical practices. I'm sorry. Now you had a question. You've been waiting, or a comment.
I think you talked about the slow movement of social change, and I see something that was very detrimental, starting with like the Darwin. It just kind of dehumanized humans, and now there's a very large post-Darwin, pseudo-Darwin movement that, hey, this theory doesn't all hold up. It comes back to the beginning of life. And as science moves forward, it more and more gives us evidence that life was there from the beginning. It's a theology question whether or not the soul is there, but how can, with all the subcellular science that's gone on, say it's not life?
I think that there's a lot of, I think, Doctor, you mentioned willful ignorance. I think that is something that it will always be with us. People will always have motives for wanting to terminate pregnancies. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to predict all the ones that people will have in the future. And people will always have aspirations for childbearing on the positive side. But I think, and as I mentioned in the talk, it's like without a strong, firm idea of what an unborn child is when it is unborn, rather than what it will get you later or what problems it might cause you later, without that concrete idea of what it is as an unborn child, the unborn are vulnerable. I mean, they vulnerable to these switcheroos, people wanting children and not wanting children, for